You're listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by the Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.
Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by James Bobick of the Wondrous Tree Fellowship. James, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Nicola. My name is James Bobick, and I am one of the co-founding members of the Wondrous Tree Fellowship. We're a small group of dedicated folks in the Tri-Cities area who advocate and try and protect trees or protect our urban forests.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, thanks. It's nice to be here.
You came a little bit of a ways, too. I've been interviewing some organizations that are based locally here in Vancouver. You're a little bit further out. Wondrous Tree Fellowship focuses more on the Tri-Cities area, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I used to work for the city of Port Coquitlam, so my base was out in the Tri-Cities there. And I'm a trades horticulturalist, so I took an interest in trees naturally. And we just sort of got together with some other folks, Nancy Furness and Laura DuPont, and some other environmentally aware people to form this group.
To start with, can you explain what the Wondrous Tree Fellowship is?
Yeah, like I was saying in introduction, basically we're a grassroots organization of people who were really concerned about what was happening in the Tri-Cities area regarding the removal of a lot of mature trees. And I think we all understand and we all know how important trees are in our community, and there's so many services that they provide us with. And we were really concerned about just the number of trees we saw coming down, the development that was going on. And so really we kind of said, what the, WTF. And so, which then turned into the Wondrous Tree Fellowship. And so we've had a little bit of fun with the name for sure, but the work that we do is very serious and we believe is very necessary.
Right. And you were telling me a little bit about this before we got on air, but for our audience, can you explain how the Wondrous Tree Fellowship came together? Like, what was your origin story?
Like I was saying, I did work for the Parks Department of Port Coquitlam, and I recall doing a tree walk one day, in which I would often do community tree walks, try and educate the public on how amazing and diverse the trees are in our urban environment. And that's when I connected with Nancy Furness, who's our fearless leader of the group. And then we just through connections, we just started meeting each other through environmental get-togethers and gatherings for the most part. And we understood that we had a common goal there. And we sort of connected that way. We thought, well, if we can start our own small organization, then maybe we can make a difference.
And we're going to be talking about urban forests quite a bit during this conversation. Can you explain what an urban forest is?
Right. It's important to understand what that is. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about an urban forest, we're really talking about all the trees that we're going to find within the city limits. So that would include parkland trees. So if you go to a community park, all the trees that you're going to find there, including the understory and the shrubs and the brush that's around there too. Also, the street trees are included in that. Residential trees and gardens are part of the urban forest. And also natural areas as well, remnants or bits of native forest that are still in many of our cities that we still have. And that would also be included as part of the urban forest.
In my mind, when I heard urban forest for the first time, I was thinking, okay, you've got a section of land within a city that might be preserved from before the city was built. It might be what we would normally think of as a forest, this area that's full of trees. We're also talking, like you said, about the street trees, about the shrubbery, about individual lawns. So it's almost like the whole city is a forest. It just happens to have some houses in certain locations. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, that's right. That's kind of how we look at it. Because, even street trees and park trees, they still provide those same services that we get from forests. And they also provide an environment for wildlife, for migrating birds as food sources. Also, they act as pollinators for bees. So there's all these great services. So we like to include all the trees that we find within a urban surroundings.
And that answers a question that I had for you, which was why urban forests are important in the services that they provide. So to, I guess, expand on that, how can urban forests lead to healthier and more resilient communities?
Yeah, that's, they provide so many services, and it's going to be a bit of a long list, but I'd love to go through them with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure. So firstly, we can look at the mental health benefits of urban forests. So, and it was really highlighted with the whole COVID epidemic that we just went through in 2020. And we saw that, stress levels were really high, anxiety was high amongst people. And one of the ways that we were able to alleviate that a little bit was to actually get out into nature, get out into forests, and to parks and to trees. Even if you were, isolated and living by yourself, you could still go out to a park and maybe meet up with friends and have a quick chat. And so we know that as soon as we get into the environment of a forest, our cortisol levels lower, our blood pressure lowers, our anxiety starts to fade away. So that's some of the mental benefits that we have from trees for sure. So mental wellness, there's less ADHD with kids, they find, that are playing in wooded areas and around trees. So very good for your mental health for sure.
I guess I should play in some trees more.
We all should.
I watched a video about salt lamps, of all things, to take a little bit of a tangent.
Right.
And they were talking about how they produce negative ions, and it's supposed to affect your mental health. And it was sort of a debunking video. Salt lamps don't actually produce enough negative ions to impact you.
Right.
But forests do.
Right.
And so the recommendation was, don't buy a salt lamp, get out in a forest. That's going to be a lot better for your mental health. And so I think it's really interesting that you talk about helping with ADHD in kids. I have ADHD. We've talked about this on other podcasts. We've done a mental health podcast. And I definitely notice that when I'm out in forests, I feel more at peace. I feel more connected to the world around me. I can think more clearly. It's just beneficial in so many ways.
Right.
I appreciate you mentioning that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, and that falls right into the whole forest bathing idea. The idea of getting out into the forest and absorbing it with all your senses, your sight, your hearing, your smell, and really letting the forest, sort of provide those benefits to you.
Now, there's a conversation around densification of cities, right? We have a growing population. We have to find housing for more and more people. And there's obviously skyscrapers being built up. But there's also just a lot more development in general in cities, and a lot of it can impact our trees. So can you talk about what the densification of communities does to urban forests, the impact that it has on them?
Yeah, it's a big issue for sure. Typically what happens is, we look at neighborhoods that might be 50 to 60 years old, and these are the typical suburban, single house on a large lot, a large yard. But of course, when those people first moved into those houses, a long time ago, one of the first things they did was plant trees, of course, right? Plant trees in your yard, right? So now those trees, 60 years on, are now actually providing these amazing services that we all need, of course. At the same time, we have this huge need for housing. So quite often, municipalities look at these older neighborhoods and find them, as prime areas to develop and to start building houses on. But sadly, these big trees that are on the lots there that are 60 years old and plus, in some cases, are at the height of their services that they provide. Basically, they're at the apex of their life, and so cutting them down for development purposes at that point is really quite sad when you think about it. And we're losing a lot by doing that.
Right, and you talk about wanting to speak more about the services that trees provide.
Right.
What else did you want to bring up on that?
Right. Well, one of the huge things that, of course, that they do is we all know they sequester carbon dioxide. They take that out of the atmosphere, and through the process of photosynthesis, and they produce energy. And of course, they take in carbon dioxide and give us oxygen. So that's one of the major things they do. And knowing that we have the climate change issues that we have, we can't afford to lose any more trees if we can help that. The other big thing they do, of course, is, we only have to go back to 2021 in June, where we had that massive heat dome over the Lower Mainland.
Right.
BC lost, I believe, 600 people, I think, to heat-related illnesses and stress. So what trees do, of course, is they mitigate that heat island effect. And the heat island effect, of course, is when the sun's rays, heat up artificial surfaces like buildings, asphalt roads, cars, anything that's basically human-made or synthetic that retains the heat. And of course, it retains that heat, holds the heat, and then radiates that out in the nighttime. So it keeps those temperatures really high. So of course, trees, just by their nature, they provide a lot of shade. So they block out those rays from hitting those surfaces. But they also do another thing which is really amazing, and that is they have their own cooling system. And just like we might sweat on a really hot day, trees will have what they call evapotranspiration. And that means they take water from the roots all the way up through their trunks, through their branching system, and they release that water through the leaves in a sort of a vapor. And that fine mist, that fine water vapor actually cools the ambient temperature almost immediately. And so what you'll find is that in areas where you've got large shade trees, the temperatures in the middle of the summer can be 6-7 degrees Celsius lower than they are in areas without trees.
Wow. I mean, that's fascinating to learn. I know that there's been an issue with cities putting down tons of concrete, and it heats up and it causes issues with flooding because there's not proper drainage. And so I knew about it from that side of things. But hearing about how much trees cool things down is something that I didn't know much about.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's yet another service that trees provide, and that's stormwater mitigation. Trees will actually slow down the amount of rainfall with their leaves. So that's one thing that they do. They'll slow down the amount of rain that hits the ground, hold a lot of that rain in the canopy, and then eventually slowly releases that to the ground. And of course, their root systems suck up a lot of water. So that's another way that they mitigate stormwater damage.
Right. When it comes to that first point around capturing carbon and releasing oxygen and being beneficial in that way, what are your thoughts on carbon capture projects, these sort of human-built facilities, I guess you might call them, that capture carbon?
Well, I have to admit that's not my specialty, so I don't know as much about that. I've heard that they're making some great gains in being able to carbon capture, but trees have been doing this for millions of years. They're the ultimate carbon catchers, and really, I think it's much easier for us to, and much quicker to just plant more trees in our communities.
Absolutely. I mean, if nature has the solution, we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, I guess.
Right. We often try and one-up Mother Nature, and in most cases, it doesn't really work.
Mm-hmm. We had that conversation, actually. I think it was our second ever episode. We were talking about engineered climate solutions as opposed to natural climate solutions. And there's some healthy debate to have there, I suppose. But it definitely seems, in my opinion, to be better when you can find those natural solutions.
Yeah, especially when they're right there and we don't have to look too far to find them. Another great thing that they do as well that I'd like to mention is, of course, pollution. And trees are incredible at reducing the amount of pollution we have. Strategically planted trees along roadsides can help deflect the harmful gases that come from cars. And as well, they have the ability to hold on to particulate matter as well. So, with trees, they have these tiny little hairs called trichomes. And trichomes will actually capture the particulate matter in the air and hold that and prevent us from breathing that in. And then when it rains, of course, it'll release those and it'll wash down to the ground where it's not harmful. So this is why they're so good for our cardiovascular system. They're good to fight against allergies, of course. So capturing pollution is another great thing that they do for us.
Right. And we've talked about how urban forests sometimes get destroyed through the development process, the construction of new buildings. And at the same time, we need those buildings, especially to try to mitigate, I suppose, the affordability crisis, right? There's a huge crisis at the moment. People can't afford places to live. How does the protection of urban forests mesh with the need to create affordable housing?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge for sure, because, most developers will look at a piece of land and, because of the economy or the affordability of building on it, they're not interested in retaining trees that might be in the middle of a property. So we understand that some trees will have to be removed. That's sort of a given. And I think even most of us environmentalists understand that, we're not going to be able to save every single tree, and that some trees, do have to be, sacrificed to create more affordable housing and densification. But what we'd like to see, though, is if that's going to be the case, then let's get creative with our design. Perhaps we can incorporate some large trees into the design, which again benefits the public. It benefits, provides more shade for the building, which is going to lessen the cost of your electricity. It's going to lessen your costs of air conditioning in the summertime, if you have it placed on the south side or west side of a building, for example. The other thing that municipalities can do is that, okay, if we're going to build a condo development, then let's give ourselves a great big space on the boulevard. Like, let's extend that. Maybe we need a 5-meter wide boulevard with a good soil depth of 1.5 to even 2 meters deep. And that way you can actually grow some very large shade trees as boulevard street trees. And I think those are going to play a much bigger role as we move forward in being able to create housing, but also retain a healthy urban forest.
Right. So you're maybe removing a tree from one location, but you're putting a tree in another and
Right.
kind of have a net neutral, I guess, potentially, or hopefully positive,
Well,
putting even more trees in.
Yeah, that's the idea. Of course, we do have to understand, though, that every time we do take a mature tree out, and let's say a lot of cities have a policy where they'll replace it with 2 trees and say, okay, we're replacing it 2 to 1. But you have to remember that those little trees that are going in, of course, are going to take 40 to 50 years to mature to the point where they're really providing the maximum services that we need. So at the same time as we need to plant new trees, we still want to retain as many of the older trees as we can. So, and I think that's where creative design comes into it. That's where councils need to sort of look at developers and say, okay, how can we incorporate more of these mature trees into the project?
I would imagine that probably needs to be incorporated into urban planning as well, because, you're planting all these trees now, but
Who's to say in 40, 50 years when they've reached their maturity and they're finally doing the job that they need to do, a city council isn't saying, okay, well, now let's tear them out and put a different development in its place.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So we need to start looking at trees as green infrastructure. Just as we have green infrastructure, we have our roads, we have our water pipes. We've got all these other infrastructure facilities that we need to take care of and maintain. Well, we need to look at trees in that same way, but as green infrastructure. And interestingly enough, it's the only infrastructure that we have in cities that actually appreciates in value. So as roads deteriorate, they cost us money. Everything costs us money except really trees actually grow in their value as they get larger. So when you look at a tree, and if it's an oak tree or a beech tree or one of the large trees that they can live for a very long time, the average building, and you might know more about this than I do, but the average building today is often built to last maybe 50, 60 years.
Yeah, they say 100.
Okay.
But it's not usually a reality that they're kept for 100 years.
Right. And that's what I found as well. So when you're looking at a tree that can live well over 100 years, if of course it's healthy and it's the right species of tree, then we have to start questioning, what is more valuable in our community here? I mean, do we want to maintain or retain those big trees and work around them or work with them, or do we want to remove them?
We've talked about sort of policy creation, urban planning, politics. We've done some protests together, and you've done many more than I have, at politicians' offices. What has your experience been like dealing with politicians?
Well, I think it's really mixed. I think there's a lot of city councilors and a lot of mayors out there who are really hoping and wanting to do some good work out there. And we see that with some of the communities now. We see New West really making strides at wanting to plant more trees and realizing there's a deficit of trees in their community. So they've done some tremendous work. Port Moody has come out with a new tree bylaw that's going to save a lot of their mature trees, and they've got their eye on wanting to increase their canopy cover to 31% over time. So we do see some good things happening, but we also see some communities that really don't seem to care all that much about trees, and it hasn't really hit the radar screen for them. So, and that really concerns us, I'm always wary of the folks that kind of say, well, climate change, isn't really a municipal issue. It's a federal issue or a provincial issue, and we shouldn't worry about that. And, we're just going to get back to basics. And that always concerns me or worries me, because there's really no more back to basics anymore. We're in a climate emergency here. Mm-hmm. And so we need to do things differently, and we need to look at trees and the role they can play and incorporate them.
Right. And when it comes to protecting the land, this is something that Indigenous peoples have been doing for millennia. So What is your relationship with the local Indigenous people like?
Right. Well, we always try and extend and offer ourselves to the Indigenous people to do partnerships with. We love to do more partnerships with them. We had one really amazing day in reconciliation, I guess you'd call it. We have a really good friend of ours, Priscilla Omulo, who you
mentioned on our last podcast.
Oh, is that right?
I can't remember if it's the last or second to last, but Priscilla's been popular on this podcast.
Right. An Indigenous lady from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations on the island, I believe. But she spent a lot of time living in Port Coquitlam, and she was looking for a way to sort of involve the community in some sort of reconciliation day. And so we united with her, the Wondrous Tree Fellowship, as well as the Port Coquitlam Arts Council. And we had this amazing day, and I believe we called it Weaving Our Story Towards Reconciliation. And this is a name that Priscilla came up with. And what we did is we brought in community members, just the public were able to join us, and an elder from the Indigenous community who came in, who specialized in doing cedar weaving or cedar bark weaving, which was just amazing stuff. And so everyone was encouraged to weave these small little hearts. And once we had all these little hearts woven and put together, and then we put it onto a larger heart that was made out of all kinds of twigs and grasses and made into a very large heart. And everyone is encouraged to place their hearts on this larger heart. And then that was taken and brought to a park, Blakeburn Park in Blakeburn Lagoons in the city of Port Coquitlam. And that is where there's a reflection garden or a memorial for the women that were the murdered Indigenous women from the Picton farm. That we felt needed to be recognized. So this was a really emotional event, and it was really heartfelt, and it was wonderful to participate in that with Priscilla.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing experience. I've done some cedar weaving before, and it's such an interesting process. We did it in the longhouse when I was in elementary school, but that's
Great.
Amazing that you were able to have that experience and support those people that were unfortunately lost their lives to a serial killer.
Yeah, that's right. And and from my personal perspective too, it was a very touching day. But of course, I was also very interested as a horticulturist to see the uses of the red cedar tree as well, and how Indigenous people use the tree. And so it was fascinating in that sense too.
Right, because the bark is harvested sustainably, if I remember.
That's right.
Sustainably.
That's right. Yeah. The way that they can harvest the bark, of course, is just by stripping it up the tree. So by doing that, you're not actually killing or harming the tree. You're taking some of the bark away from it, but you're not going to, circle that tree, which would eventually kill the tree. So yeah, it's done sustainably.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I wouldn't have thought of this question on my own, but you prompted me with a couple ideas before the podcast started. What insights can you gather about the socioeconomic well-being of a community by examining their urban forests?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a really important question because there's a thing we call tree equity. And if you were to take a drive anywhere, almost any city in North America, really, and let's say you couldn't see the houses and you just were seeing this tree-lined streets, well, what you would find almost in every case is that the more affluent areas of the city would have these beautiful tree-lined streets, these great big beautiful shade trees. And then when you went to areas that were of low income or racialized communities, perhaps, what you would find there is very few trees, if in many cases no trees at all. And again, this became glaringly obvious in the Lower Mainland as a huge problem when we had that heat dome, when all the people, had passed away from heat illnesses. And what we're finding is that in areas that didn't have any tree cover, that the incidences of hospital visits due to heat stress or heat ailments was 3 times higher in areas where there weren't any trees. So this is a direct effect of inequity, really, in our communities, in our cities. You take a drive to, around beautiful Point Grey or Shaughnessy or Kitsilano and some of those areas there, you're going to find these beautiful, beautiful trees. But when you go to, some of the east side neighborhoods, there's a lot less trees, very few trees, with maybe the exception of Killarney, which is a well-treed area. And of course, they have a golf course there too. But that becomes it's becoming a real issue now, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And a lot of social issues are addressed through education. We talk about this a lot on the podcast, how education is necessary to make sure people are informed so that they know to take action. But why is education so important to your organization specifically?
Right. Well, we always sort of, the way we look at it is that if people know how important trees are in our community, that they're more likely to take notice of what's going on in their community. If trees are coming down, or if they want to grow more trees in their community, they're more likely to get involved politically. Maybe they're going to call up their city and say, hey, I'd like a tree planted in front of my place too. So if we get people to speak out, and I think you can do that through education, that's a really, really important part of what we do. I like to say that we do 3 things really with our group, and that is we advocate, educate, and we celebrate trees. So we do all of those things, and I think they're equally as important. So the advocation work, of course, we do is sometimes we protest, sometimes we, get in touch with councils and we try and talk to them and hopefully have some influence over some of their decisions, which would be great. And then, of course, education. We do tree walks. One of my favorites is the Earth Day tree walk that we do in Port Moody at Rocky Point Park. And that one's great because we go through the native forest and we talk about all the indigenous plants and some of their uses and how important they are to our communities. And of course, we did a foraging workshop with some high school students in Port Moody as well. And that was really terrific as well because a lot of these kids really hadn't gotten out into forest before. And the idea that they didn't know much about the ecosystems that existed around them was a little shocking, but honestly, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, And so we feel that, there's an old saying that, where your heart leads, your mind and your body follows. So if we can get people to really fall in love with nature and forests and green spaces, we think that, they're going to fight for those.
Right. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about wanting to protect trees, they might think of the term tree hugger. They might think of, the 1960s hippies, for instance.
Right.
So there's not a lot of emphasis on kids in modern times.
That's true.
What are you noticing about the reaction that you're receiving from these kids? Like, have they been interested in protecting forests? Do they have this passion that you and your group have?
Well, we certainly find that they do if they're given the opportunity. So one of the things that we did is we had
our nature art contest. So we took all kinds of, lots of little kids in the Tri-Cities area, and we encouraged them to find what we call a sit spot. And that could be near a creek or somewhere in the forest, a quiet place where they can, draw and do some artwork. But really what they're sort of doing as well is they're experiencing forest bathing. So, they're actually in amongst the trees. So we know that there's health benefits there, and we think we saw that the kids were very encouraged about being able to do that. That was an exciting thing for them to do. So yeah, we think it works for sure.
Right. And I mean, based off of this conversation, it sounds like your organization is doing a ton of great work. And I'm curious to know what your hope is for the future of Wondrous Tree Fellowship.
We just hope to keep spreading the word and getting people interested and excited about trees. The more people we can get to become socially active, politically active, understanding how important trees are in our community, then that's really ultimately that's the way we're going to protect them. So yeah, we just want to keep doing the same sort of work and broadening our horizons a little bit.
One of the questions I like to ask on all of the podcast is what our audience can do and help. So in that case, what can our audience do to support Wondrous Tree Fellowship? And also, what can they do to help protect trees in their own neighborhoods?
Right. Well, we encourage anyone to come out and join us. We have all kinds of events. We have a Facebook page that you can look us up on and see what's happening. We have an event actually tomorrow. So because I believe this is airing on Monday. So Tuesday on November 7th, we have our Tri-Cities Urban Forest Forum, and that's at Douglas College in Coquitlam. Doors open at 6:00 and speakers are from 7 to 9. And this is going to be a really great event because we have speakers from across the Lower Mainland, from different municipalities who are really well versed in urban forest knowledge. And we also have Brian Minter. Of course, Brian Minter, our sort of locally famous gardener, who is going to be there talking about the importance of shade trees and different types of shade trees that we can use that are suitable for climate change issues that we have to deal with. So we have events like that coming up. We also do celebrations as well, right? Celebration is one of the things that we love to do. We take part in the Rotary Club May Day Parade. It's in Port Coquitlam, where that gives us an opportunity to dress up in costumes and have fun and sort of celebrate. It can be challenging being an environmentalist sometimes. So we like to celebrate when we can and celebrate trees when we can. And we also have an event coming up towards the end of November 25th, and it's traditionally very close to Lost Species Day. Now, that sounds a little depressing, and it sounds like it's a bit of a negative. But, we were originally going to use that as a day of protest at the political offices. But we've just recently, of course, just yesterday, there was an announcement about the BC government and coordinating with the federal government to put a whole lot of money, as well as Indigenous leadership as well in British Columbia, to try and save and put aside 30% of the land of our most valuable and fragile ecosystems, and actually protect those areas. So this is a small victory, I would say, and maybe it's a large victory. So what I was just talking to Nancy today, and we were thinking, maybe we need to make this more of a celebration. So that's what we're going to do on the 25th. And so if you'd like to come out and join us at Lions Park, I'm not quite sure what the time is going to be yet, but we're going to have a carnival band there. We're going to have all kinds of great stuff happening. Booths from various stream keepers groups and environmental groups will be there. So it's going to be a bit of a celebration, I think. And we may even invite some local politicians to tell us what's happening with that. So we're all looking forward to that as well.
Amazing. Well, it's important to celebrate those wins when you can, because they don't always come around all
That's right.
often.
That's very true.
I'm really glad that we're able to have you on the podcast before these events happen, so our audience knows about them. And I don't know how many people are listening from Port Coquitlam. Our analytics don't show specificity like that, but hopefully we have some people that'll come out and join you. And as we're getting towards the end of the conversation, I'm curious to know if there's anything that we haven't touched on yet that you're wanting to bring up.
Well, interestingly enough, we didn't touch much on a little bit maybe, but tree percentage or tree canopy percentage. And that's a really important thing, because just to talk about that a little bit would be nice.
That'd be great.
Because it's a great way to measure the livability and the health of a community. And so what we see is the tree canopy coverage is a way of measuring, of course, what it sounds like, tree canopy and the area that covers. So if you were to take like a drone or whatever and go straight up in the air and you look straight down on the community, the areas that would be blocked out or covered by tree canopy will give you your percentage that you have in a city.
And this is the radius of the tree branches, is it?
That's right. Yeah, the tree branches and some of the shrub material as well would affect that as well. And so what we're seeing is, most communities have an average of somewhere, they all differ, but somewhere around the average of 20 to 23%. In some cases, Vancouver is at 23% canopy coverage. Some areas are a little higher than that, but it's generally agreed that we'd like to see most of those communities come up to around 30% or 31%. That's kind of the sweet spot. I know Metro Vancouver is hoping to move that to 40%, which is very ambitious. But that would be great to see if communities can all come along and do that. But so that's a really good indicator of how we're doing. And, shockingly, and I hate to point out one particular city, but, shockingly, and I was surprised to see this too, that Richmond has 12% canopy coverage, which is just not, really isn't good enough.
And is that something that a city like Richmond is able to easily tackle? Because I know that city in particular is built on silt. Is that an environment where you can have trees, or do you just have to be careful about certain types of trees are better than others?
Well, to be fair to Richmond, the one thing that they have that most other communities don't have is they still have some farmland left there. Right. And of course, that's not generally treed area. That's agricultural land. Whereas other communities like Surrey or Port Moody still have actually a fair amount of natural forest within their city limits. So that can skew numbers a little bit for sure. So sometimes, you look at the city of Surrey, for example, and I think they were once at 10 years ago, they were at 33% canopy coverage. And in 10 years' time, now they're down to about 27% canopy coverage. So they've actually lost some. And of course, being a large area like Surrey, they have a lot of native forest still there. But slowly they're losing that. And so we need to be concerned about that.
Right. And that's because of a development boom that's happening there?
Exactly. Yeah. Just development boom. I mean, they have very strong tree protection laws in Surrey, but it's the enforceability of those laws and also making sure that development doesn't always trump those regulations as well.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's a really important piece. Is there anything else that...
Well, getting back to the political side of things again a little bit, one of the things that the BC government has done recently, as you probably know, is they've had and this is kind of fun, it's kind of interesting, but it's a naughty and nice list. So they've got the naughty and nice list of communities, municipalities that maybe haven't built or developed enough housing in the last little while, or that are reluctant to develop areas. So they've made this list, and what I would really like to see is them have a list for tree canopy coverage. a naughty and nice list so that we can highlight some of the people who are doing, communities that are doing great jobs with planting trees, and also highlight some of the folks that aren't doing a good enough job. And because, when you think about it, and we talked a little bit about all the health services that trees provide us with and how important they are to us, that tree canopy coverage and the amount of trees we have in our community really becomes a health issue. And of course, health, we know, is under the jurisdiction of the provincial government. So when we look at it that way, we think that would be a good thing to do, implement. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be great to have things laid out a little bit more simply too, because there's always political spin, right?
Right.
When you think about affordable housing, for instance, you'll see some cities say, we've had X number of units created.
Right.
And in my mind, I'm always thinking, but what percentage is that?
Right.
Because that's what actually matters. The number is sort of irrelevant because that's going to vary drastically from city to city. So if you had a city saying, well, we planted 10,000 trees, is that good or not? I don't know. But if you have a naughty and nice list, that would be a really easy way to say, okay, that is actually a good job that city's doing. That city has some work to do.
Yeah, I would like to see that. And there's one other thing that I'll just touch on again that we talked, because there's so many health benefits from trees, but we talked a little bit about forest bathing. We talked about the mental health aspects of being in a forest, but there's also the physical wellness that forests and trees create for us. And even without even knowing, as we walk through the forest, we're surrounded by all these wonderful trees, and they give off these volatile compounds. These are what they call phytoncides. And phytoncides are actually the way the tree, it's the defense system for the tree. So all these aerosols and these organic compounds are sort of in the air. And of course, they have antimicrobial qualities, antibacterial qualities. So that helps the tree's defense system. But when we breathe those in, they actually help us as well. So what they do for us is they actually stimulate the growth of a certain type of white blood cell. They call NKs, which stands for natural killers. So once they're in our system, these white blood cells, of course, will attack tumors, will attack viral infections. So when we walk around in the forest, we're actually getting an immune system boost. And so it does have physical implications for us as well if we spend time in the forest. So, and they're long lasting. So a study was done in Japan where people stayed out in the forest for 3 straight days, almost, like we do a camping trip. Mm-hmm. And they came back and realized that the level of these white blood cells was higher for up to 30 days afterwards. So it just goes to show you that we need these exposures to nature as much and as often as we can. And we need them close to where we live. That's really important for us.
Yeah, that's incredible. I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's really amazing research. And I have another question for you, which is around native species and non-native species of plants. So is it beneficial to plant non-native trees in a city environment, whether it's in a forested section or whether it's just in someone's backyard? Is there benefit to that, or should we always be focusing on trying to have native species?
That's a really great question, actually. It's a question I like to talk about. I'm somewhere in the middle on that one when it comes to urban trees, because we have 2 things happening here. We know that a lot of the insects, the birds, a lot of the species that we have in this area have a symbiotic relationship with native plants and native trees. So we want to see a lot of those trees planted, and we want to see a lot of native plants put into people's gardens because, for pollinating insects like small bees, for example, they may be very selective, and they may only pollinate and they may only survive on 1 or 2 types of flowers, a very specific type of flower. So we need to provide those species with as much native flora as we can. But of course, in a city environment, it's not always easy to plant trees that are native trees for street trees, for example. If we were to plant a Douglas fir tree as a street tree, beautiful big shade tree, and you do see them in some places, but of course they're very prone to damage in windstorms, snow damage. So large branches can fall and damage property or cars or people for that matter. So we have to be very selective where we put these trees. But in an open park area, or someone has a very large yard, I would certainly encourage them to plant some native species and some native trees because they're very important for all kinds of other creatures as well.
Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up?
I think that's pretty good. I don't think I can think of anything else. I've talked your ear off enough, probably. So.
It's been great. I've loved the conversation. I feel like I've learned so much more about trees than I knew before, and I imagine that's going to be the same for our audience. So,
well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate coming in to talk to you about trees.
Absolutely. And this has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. Today I've been joined by James Bobick, and we've been talking about Wondrous Tree Fellowship, which helps to protect trees in the Tri-Cities area and beyond.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast hosted by NICOLA SPURLING, brought to you by the Flag Shop, and inspired by a social justice coloring book.